Welcome to Avoiding Goodhart's Law, using SLOs as tools, not cudgels. The concepts of SLI, SLO and Error Budget are there to balance risk and reward. Risk around the acceptable rate of change, and reward being the business success and customer contentment. Using such metrics to punish teams for exceeding budgets or force acceptance of change within the business is a path to failure. This session will give some hints for success, but first let me introduce myself. G'day, I'm Marco. I'm an ex-CTO who has worked for one of the top 50 international banks. I've supported data centers for hospitals and service providers, and I've worked for some of the industry's largest vendors. I've lived in 3 countries and I've managed teams across 13 countries. I also spent 5 years as an industry analyst, running the data science team at 451 Research. Seeing technology from every side, as an operator, a developer, an analyst, a vendor, a buyer, and a CTO, it gives me a unique view on technology. And you can read some of my writing or interviews in the publications on the left here, or on my website, tech-whisperer.com. So, enough about me. It's good to have targets, right? Think of Robin Hood. The story where he places a child against a tree and he loads up an arrow and aims. With an apple as the target on the child's head, this is the story of a skilled archer. But without the target apple, it's the story of a crazy dangerous guy shooting arrows at children. So it's good to have targets, as long as you use them correctly. Today's session comes in 3 chapters. I will talk about how I experienced Goodhart's Law before I even knew it existed. Then we will think about SLIs in a better way, across dimensions. Finally, I'm going to throw in a few hints about negotiating your SLAs and give you some further reading. Let's get going. I will get to Goodhart's Law in a moment, but I want to tell a war story first. So depending on your personality, you're either going to enjoy my story or you might already be searching for Goodhart on Wikipedia. And that's gaming the system. Some folks see gaming the system as the smart move. Others equate the phrase to cheating. I'm sort of more in the second system a little bit. For me, gaming the system means manipulating the rules meant to protect a system to instead manipulate the system towards your desired outcome. In a prior life back in Australia, I worked for a service provider that supported all the hospitals in the state. In hospitals, nurses take lab samples. They get sent to the labs. They are processed and the results get transmitted back to the patient record, where the nurse back in the ward can immediately look them up. Pretty simple, right? By the way, the wards are sort of up on the 16th floor somewhere, and the labs are normally in the basement of another building on the campus. So it's quite some distance between them. Technically, it sort of looked like this. Messages from the Unix system, it was a lab system, the hardware would be sent into message queues. The queues fed the lab updates into the mainframe system, holding the patient records. Now, everything here allegedly spoke a common HL7 standard, so there would never be any problems. But the support of the HL7 standard was not perfect. Malformed messages would get stuck in the queue. We would get phone calls from hospitals that they had to go to manual procedures. By the way, the backup procedure, if the messages got stuck this way, was for the nurses to physically run from the ward down to the labs to get the results and bring them back. That was not optimal, as patients' health was at risk from the delay and from the nurse being absent from the ward. To take care of this, we agreed an SLA that was, if the message queues got higher than 100, the service provider would have to refund money back. That should address things, right? I coded a monitor script so that when the queue length approached 100, alerts would go off. Monitor icons would go from green to yellow to red. But as technicians, we focused on the measure as the target, as the goal. We even built capacity plans around making sure the queue processing got all the power it needed. Now you may think, well, that's great, Marco, top-notch result. Lab results get back to the ward in time, right? The only problem was we'd still get these pesky phone calls from the nurses in the ward saying the system sucked. They were always having to run down and manually collect results. But we'd look and the message queues were empty. The problem was the transactions were timing out before they even hit the message queue. We were managing the capacity plan, in fact, the whole application, to the metric, not the outcome. Now, years later, since that experience, I learned that the behaviour had a name. Yes, we're finally getting to Goodhart. You see, Goodhart was an economist in the UK, and in 1975 he stated, "Any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes." It's kind of wordy. I guess he was English and he's a politician. What can you expect? Wordy's what you get, right? But here's what he meant. Basically, the law says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. You see, Q length was a good measure of Q function. We were managing to them as a target for success, building capacity plans, so on, based on the Q instead of the successful laboratory transactions in patient records. So how do we avoid Goodhart's law? We need to let SLIs be measures and use SLOs as the goals. So what should we measure? Well, the key here is to stand in other people's shoes. It's to see everything from a few different angles. Hence, 3 dimensions. Remember, SRE is really about balancing the risk of unavailability against rapid innovation and efficient operation. We embrace that risk by giving it a value through well-defined and well-governed service-level objectives and indicators and agreements. As you are identifying SLIs, we need measures that see the whole picture in 3 key dimensions. Let's step through a simple example of each based on that hospital environment. The example will not give specific SLIs that you can apply to your environment. It's not meant to. The example is intended to share the thought process so that you can apply it back in your own environment on Monday morning. First, let's quickly review the SLI, SLO, SLA model. The SLIs are the numbers, and they work better when they're percentiles, by the way. Avoid averages. In mature environments, SLIs are nested. They will combine from SLIs that sit against the code and the technology up to SLIs that sit next to the customer. They are a defined quantitative measure, a metric. You will then set limits on the SLIs, say upper or upper and lower, giving us the SLO, the service level objective. SLOs should capture the performance and availability levels that, if barely met, would keep your typical customer happy. They're generally a target, failures are less than X, or a range, responses will be between X and Y. Generally, and I like to translate the SLOs into periodic budgets that I then track weekly, but that weekly timing, that sort of depends on your own release cycle and so on, your SDLC. The SLAs define what actions are acceptable once the budget gets used up. Defining those ahead of time is critical. It's very hard to make the right decisions in the heat of the moment when all of the monitors are red and the phones are ringing off the hook and you've turned off your cell phone because you can't stand the text messages anymore. So getting ahead of time and accepting this is how we're going to react when we run out of these error budgets is very important and very valuable. One additional thing, full outages happen less these days, so the focus needs to be on slowdowns instead. I wrote about this, I have the link here, it's at the end of the session as well. Rather than traditional uptime availability, I try to focus on the customer domain and their experience and using successful customer requests as the measure instead. To capture the overall environment, the nested SLIs supporting the CX ones should cover each of the 3 dimensions. Firstly, let's start with code. From our code, we want functional code that does not fail, and also feature additions and write-downs of technical debt. You'll be dealing with multiple languages, so you want to be sure that the metrics will work across them generically, where you can avoid metrics that only apply to a specific language. It's too much extra handling. Also, it will not be, SLIs will not be limited to applications that you've built in-house. You're going to have third-party applications, as we did, like SAP and the ABAP language, or a SaaS application like Salesforce that you might have to be responsible for. Maybe what you're managing is something environmental like Kubernetes, and then you're not just going to be watching the code transaction errors, you're looking at the configurations instead. So some of the nested SLIs around code might even be YAML code accuracy. You also want to avoid silos of data here. You don't want the SRE team to be working off one source of metrics while the development team is working off another. You need a single source of SLI truth as part of deciding what you will base the SLOs on. For the sample indicator, let's embed a few clarifications. Our first step would be to focus on well-formed updates. That specifies the transaction. We want to update the patient record and acknowledge completion, and that specifies the reaction we expect to see. And in this case, we agree to using application performance monitoring, or APM, as the tool. So that specifies the source: transaction, reaction, source. Look, I'm familiar with AppDynamics for APM, but you could just as easily use Datadog or New Relic. In fact, as we're really only concerned about code for this SLI, you might prefer observability offerings like Honeycomb or Instana. I think Instana was just acquired by IBM, right? The observability segment's getting quite interesting right now. Anyway, so some of the SRE books recommend, good over bad ratios for SLIs. If you control all the code, that can work. But in this example, I am avoiding the fail ratio as there are too many elements out of our control. The HL7 update transactions were coming out of a purchase software running on the lab's hardware. We had no way of fixing that code. We just had to wait for the vendor to patch it. Also, the queuing systems were third-party software as well, so we could not tweak them to respond better to malformed entries coming out of the lab's hardware. We couldn't be certain that we would reach a point where the HL7 outputs were always well formed. So the basic code SLI would need to be focused on well-formed updates getting to the code that we were writing and controlled. For the code SLO, we apply a goal to the indicator. We're already assuming well-formed HL7 records, so that we can set this fairly high. Again, we're being clear about the transaction, the reaction, and the source. It's easy to set this goal too high. Of course, people want to say 100% for SLOs, but that means there's no experimentation, there's no innovation. It needs to be just over the level that will keep customers happy. Too high and opportunity costs are being wasted. For the code SLA, we need an outcome. Note that the SLA goal allows some wiggle room from the SLO. We've added a time range now, and the SLO must be met over a sliding range of 28 days in this case. The SLA should specify what happens when the SLA is missed. Does one department owe the other department a refund? Perhaps something gets locked down. Maybe the software release cycle gets automatically frozen for 28 days until things are back on track. The SLA is the part that is negotiated. In a perfect world, this is defined by the business or customer and set back into the technology, and then you build the SLOs and SLIs underneath it. In reality, it's a conversation. Normally, I wouldn't put technical phrases like well-formed HL7 in the SLA. It would be a customer outcome, but we'll come to that later in this session. Okay, so you have some SLIs and some SLOs around code, the first dimension. And hopefully that gives developers a sense of balance, something to measure opportunities to add features and innovate and clear technical debt against business impact. Code runs on infrastructure. So of course, that can have customer experience impacts as well. You have availability concerns. How are you going to support updates to the infrastructure, updating operating systems, moving to different cloud or service providers or network providers, adding new locations to better support remote customers? These risks to availability and performance, they all need to be well balanced. As we add the infrastructure dimension, things get more complicated. You'll be dealing with the full stack and often multiple stacks in multiple locations. In our hospitals, for example, we had pretty much everything, from Windows client applications to the lab machines were Unix-based, and the message queuing, the MQ systems were Unix-based, and then we had the IBM mainframe for the patient record system. And these were scattered across the state, that is physically 1/3 of the geography of mainland USA. So, and none of it was close to any cloud providers. So networks really mattered. Some of the SLIs around infrastructure, they're going to be inherited SLIs as well from your cloud, network, or service providers. So like for code, you want to avoid silos of data. It's best to have a single source of SLI truth for infrastructure. What you're looking you're looking for the infrastructure's ability to support load and deliver predictable latency. Now, we need to include the impact of all of the infrastructure into those components into the SLI somehow. So we look at the total transaction time as a way of doing that. Now, this would certainly have nested SLIs for each piece of the puzzle. An SLI for the labs update, leaving the labs hardware, and an SLI for the message queue, adding and leaving the queue, an SLI for the labs update, arriving at the mainframe, an SLI for traversing the networks in between all these components, an SLI for adding it to the patient record, and that SLI might even have a nested SLI for the database inserts into the patient record system. You can get too crazy with SLIs, so you've got to use some judgment to try and whittle them down. Define SLIs at system boundaries or at team boundaries. The strength of a system boundary is that they're less likely to change. You've got to replace an entire, a system to do that, but they sometimes end up too detailed. The strength of team boundaries is that it makes it easier for you to assign responsibility to a team or an individual. This SLI you own, you're responsible for ensuring that we hit it. For SLOs on infrastructure, you may want to express the SLOs in the shape of performance curves, just to show you an alternative. However, we expect in this environment the bulk of transactions to occur normally within about 30 seconds. That was well within the technical capabilities of the infrastructure. Some may take longer. For example, where there is a high system load, you will see that we have a long tail here of about 5 minutes at the top of the curve. As we move to the SLA, negotiated with the customer, you see this big jump. We're only committing to this 5-minute time frame with them. Now, this actually came about after conversations with the ward nurses, because we were out there and we were asking about time. We expected them to be like the usual customer and demand instant response times, but their view was different. It takes time for the samples to be delivered to the wards, so they expect some delay from taking the sample to information coming back. And they had a view of the overall processing time. So for them, the time frame was about beating the time it took a nurse to run from the ward to the labs whenever the system was down, if the doctor ordered them to go immediately and get the results back. Now, that run time in one of the hospitals we were talking to took about 10 minutes. So when we offered them 5 minutes as a guarantee, they were very happy. They were ecstatic. That was an important lesson for me, and it allowed us to avoid unnecessary infrastructure costs. It does not always have to be as fast as possible, just as fast as necessary. Now, of course, when I worked for banks on stock trading systems, they had a very different attitude. The processing time was a competitive differentiator for the traders, and as fast as possible and never mind the cost was the approach. The dimensions, however, of code and infrastructure are not the full picture. I saved the best for last. Our third dimension is the business, or if you're a non-profit or government body, it's the customer experience. This is about the revenue or the service production capabilities of the application. As we add the business dimension in, we now have our full set of 3 dimensions. It can become difficult to measure the full experience. You will want to get out to the customer interface, and that may require browser integration or mobile agents or something of that sort. For availability and to track predictability of response times, you may even want to add in synthetic testing tools. I'm going to keep it a little simpler for our hospital example because I like to do that. Now we're looking at the doctor and nurse experience. Now, we built and owned the patient record application, so we knew we could add in our own specific measure there. From observing behaviours in the wards and talking to the nurses and doctors, we worked out, by the way, better to talk to the nurses than the doctors. They have a better idea of the work being done. We worked out anyway that the nurses had an instinctive expectation of when the labs would come back, and they'd start looking at the record. If the update was not there, they'd do something else for a few minutes and they'd come back and they'd try and look at the record again. So those repeated record lookups, they were our sign that we were not meeting their instinctive expectations, and soon they would be calling us to complain. So we coded the repeat counter into the patient record application, into the code that we controlled. You'll see the other part here. Why did we set it beyond 10 seconds in there? Well, at first we just had the within 5 minutes. But then we had a problem. We kept missing that target even when the records were processing fine, because there'd be the odd nurse here or there who just never waited for anything ever. And they would just sit there hitting enter and again and again and again. So we added beyond 10 seconds to sort of get it past those people who were just clicking again, again, again. And understanding how that process, how we got there, I think is the important part of that piece of the story, of that you will renegotiate as SLIs and SLOs and SLAs as time passes and as you better understand what their needs are. Now, as we look at the SLA, we want the SLO here, we want a low number or 0 as the outcome. Now, you might have expected a tiny percentage here, but this SLO, that we do 0.000001 or something like that percent. But this SLO includes all the malformed transactions coming out of that crappy lab system. So we needed to be realistic with our partners. In fact, this SLO sort of nests everything in the system into it. And again, the SLA here has reaction room against the SLO so that you can break the SLA but not be breaking you can break the SLO but not be breaking the SLA yet. And the 8-hour time frame on this came from the nurses as they thought in terms of their shift. So when we started talking about 28 days, they were like, no, just 8 hours. I just need to know if it's going to, I need you to focus on getting it back by the end of my shift so that I can complete all my records and the patient documentation they had to do. So with this 3-way approach, we were really starting to work with the customer, with the nurses and doctors towards their success instead of a metric or a contract. You see, both parties were now using the SLA as a tool instead of a cudgel to beat each other with. Now, of course, there were many more SLAs and SLOs and SLIs in reality. Remember, my goal with the examples was not to match reality, but to step you through the thought process, the experience. You need to consider all 3 dimensions for success. The SLAs are not there to beat each other up. They are there to capture the mutual understanding. You reach that mutual understanding through negotiation. SLIs, SLOs, SLAs, error budgets, they're all just the tools to support negotiations. So negotiating is a key skill for any SRE person. There are some great books out there, although they can be annoying. They can be a little contradictory sometimes. Getting to yes, getting to no. And most of them are targeted at sales folks. Personally, I'm a win-win negotiator. I want everybody to leave feeling like they won. That is not always possible. Anyway, here's a few quick thoughts based on my experiences. Know thyself. Know thyself is not a new idea. It was carved into the temple of Apollo in Greece around the 5th century BC. So as humans, we've been trying to know ourselves for a fair while. But in terms of preparing to engage in negotiation, it's the best place to start. Consider your level of maturity as an SRE team and environment. How much can you control? What risk can you absorb? And still have the business survive and still keep your job? Is that risk evenly spread throughout the year? Or do you have peak periods like, as I'm recording this, we're coming up to Black Friday or the Super Bowl at the start of next year or New Year's Eve? Are there sort of uneven periods where you need a different SLO for a period of time? Are you in a period of significant transformation in the enterprise? Will the things be the same in 12 months or be so different as to make today's SLIs meaningless? Then, you want to minimize what you're creating that will be immediately disposed of. Again, I suppose in a way you could think about it as a form of debt, right? Use all this type of questions to gather your needs. You probably have a feeling for what expectations the business will have, and so you also need to develop an instinct for what will you need to deliver that. Could you accept tougher SLAs if you were allowed to grow your team, or if you're allowed to purchase supporting tools? Well, be aware of that ahead of time as you come into the negotiation, because that's what a negotiation is. It's the time to state, I can give you this if you give me that. When consulting, I try and brainstorm this quietly with people to identify where my outer boundaries are. What will be just unacceptable and what will be too easy. Preparing to engage in this way is about gathering information. What you do with this information is you build a strategy model, a strategic model. There's also a people side to this as well. Gather opinions about the people you will be negotiating with. What are their goals? What's their aptitude to risk versus innovation? Even subtle things like what time of day are they more open to fresh ideas or in a better mood? Also, in preparation, identify a facilitator. If this will be you, then read up and practice facilitation ahead of time. Facilitation is a very specific skill, and I have learned that it is extremely powerful to have a good facilitator in negotiations. Consider bringing somebody in, a contractor or a service partner who does it for a living, or it can be great to bring in a leader from another part of your organization who you happen, from experience, is a natural facilitator. There's someone who can park their own ego, their own needs, and draws input from everyone in the meeting. They're reading the room the whole time. It's good because it can give that volunteer career profile, so it's a win-win. All right, you get a great facilitator, and they get sort of profile within the company. Once you've gathered everything and you have a penciled-in strategic model, it's time to schedule your meetings and get your negotiation on. Negotiations have a general flow in a standalone meeting. I'm not going to go into great detail here. There isn't enough time, but the first step is sort of the warm-up. Everyone's just come from something else, and you need to get them in the room or on the Zoom and get them all thinking together. Here, you're going to set the scope of the discussion, the application, the dimensions, the business value, and what they will get out of participating. Be brief, because they're all experts in some aspect here, and you don't want to turn over every little stone while you're just warming them up. Try and get everyone to talk. Ask them to spend 1 or 2 minutes describing their aspect. And the nominated facilitator, or if that's you, then you, has to be politely close down anyone who starts to exceed a brief introduction. Your next step is the test drive. You present what some of the indicators under consideration could be. Give one specific example of an SLI, SLO, SLA chain to clarify for them, something real. You're testing the water here, so try to make this something that could live on as a final agreement. Again, something real. And then you get their reactions, and you assess. Now they have something to talk about. Assess the business value. Is this the best place to start? Will pursuing the scope give return on investment, or should we be looking at something else first? Do you need to balance innovation and risk for this application? If the application is something that is stale and has been there for 10 years and gets updated once a year, that's not where you need this. Will you just freeze changes for a while to return to stability? What would the action be? Will it be a refund? Is it some sort of budget transfer between, sales and IT? And if so, how long would you freeze for? And what would be the amount of such a trade-off of budgets? An important part in this phase is extracting and capturing assumptions. You've got to clarify assumptions, and clarifying assumptions is why footnotes on SLAs can often be longer than the actual SLA. The SLA is this long and the footnotes is 2 pages. Then you hit the propose stage. So now you've got more information from everyone, and you can update your test drive and make a new proposal. So a few hints in here when you hit the proposal. Predictability is often more important, almost always more important than speed. The higher variance in response times, the more user experience is affected. Avoid spreads that are greater than 3 to 6 standard deviations. In fact, if your spread is greater than 6 standard deviations, that's an indicator of low capability of process. It's not good. Then you hit the recur phase. So what you're going to do now is you're going to assess the new proposal. Expect to iterate or recur through these stages, as this is where the real negotiation occurs. You may need to schedule follow-up meetings. If you do, for each meeting, always take a few minutes to revisit the warm-up, get them in the room. Just, you don't have to do the couple of minute briefs each time, but maybe just restate the scope and goal, recap the conversations to date, and try to acknowledge something from each person during the warm-up. You want them participating in the conversation. You want them feeling respected and valued. And then hopefully at some stage, you'll reach the agree phase. This is the final presentation of the finished SLI, SLO, SLA for sign-off. If it's a service provider, it might be a physical sign-off, but it's worth saying that you will need everyone to commit in email, even if it's an internal SLA, SLO error budget. They need to commit on the record, and there's two reasons for this. One, because it's useful to have the record later on. You did say you did commit to this. But the more important one here is that you will then find people who are reluctant. And if they're reluctant, it means you missed something during the assess phase. So you need to return to that and try again to work out why they don't want to accept this as the agreement for delivery. Okay, thanks for coming on that journey with me. Here's what I hope that you take away from this session. I hope you learn from my experience. Don't manage to the metrics. Focus on the outcomes. The full transaction, the complete process, the overall experience. Don't use service levels to beat each other up. Use them to become preemptive. Use them so that you can offer more services ahead of time. If you realize that you're under budget, it might be a time to walk across to development and go, hey, this is a great chance to write off some more technical debt. We've got a bit of leverage here. When you build out your service levels, remember to assess them against the three dimensions: code, infrastructure, business, or customer experience. Are you seeing the full picture? Is some critical aspect being overlooked? Is there sort of like a black box in the system somewhere that you've just that you missed? One of the most critical things around customer experience, remember, is predictability. With higher variance in response times, the more user experience is affected. So keep your eyes on the transactions that are the outliers. Outliers annoy the crap out of users. If I hit it and it takes 15 seconds to respond, then I know I have enough time to swap screens and read something and swap back after 15 seconds and it's there. But if I swap back and it's not there, and now suddenly for no reason whatsoever it takes 4 minutes, I'm going to be annoyed. So you need to sort of keep an eye. That's why I talk about percentiles rather than averages, and keep an eye on the outliers. Finally, realize that if you want to be great at SRE, you will need negotiation skills. Negotiation, it's useful for life and it's useful for SRE. Look, as promised, here are some links to reading on similar topics. This is the time to switch back to this screen if you're watching online and take a snapshot of the links here. You can catch up with most of my thoughts on my website. I have a link to Goodhart's law there for you if you want to read about him. I have a link to the slowdown is the new outage piece that I wrote about how we're moving on from outages to slowdowns as a focus area. And if you found this session interesting, then connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. In fact, I might have interesting thoughts tomorrow, you never know. This is my first time with this presentation, so feedback would be great. What caught your attention? What was important that I missed? Valuable help to me, and I would greatly appreciate it. With that, I want to thank Usenix and SREcon for hosting this session. I want to thank the folks who were working with me to get the session uploaded for their patience. We had a few, they have been very patient with me, I will say that. And I want to thank you for your time today. And I will see you in the Slack channels.